She had been born to heal what others destroyed, and now she would watch him die. The Alpha King lay on black marble, his body convulsing beneath silk that no longer held warmth. Sweat pooled where his crown had fallen, catching the moonlight like a puddle of spilled silver. His breath came in fractured gasps, each one a desperate negotiation with the venom that was rewriting his blood. Sarah stood in the shadows of the throne room, her small frame swallowed by the vastness of stone and starlight filtering through impossible windows. 17 years of exile had taught her to move without sound, to exist in the margins where the unwanted learned to survive. She had been banished from this kingdom for one reason. Her gift terrified them. Omegas were meant to be docile, ornamental, bound. But Sarah could smell poison in the air like other wolves smelled fear. She could taste the composition of venom on her tongue, the bitter iron of nightshade, the cold copper of basilisk tears, the crystalline edge of something far older. The Alpha King had rejected her bond before she was even old enough to understand what rejection meant. She had knelt before him at 16, newly presented, her omega scent still soft and untested. He had looked through her as though she were glass, worse than glass, as though she did not exist at all. The rejection had come swift and public, ceremonial in its cruelty. By nightfall, she was marked for exile. Now, poisoned and drowning in his own blood, he was dying, and now she would choose. The venom coursed through him in waves of luminescent purple, visible beneath the paper-thin skin of his wrists, climbing his neck like ivy made of nightmares. His eyes, once sharp enough to command armies, were rolling back, pupils blown wide and unseeing. The poison was old magic, the kind that didn't kill quickly. It unmade a person from the inside, dissolving nerve endings, turning blood into betrayal. Sarah moved forward. Her feet made no sound on the marble. The guards outside the throne room were unconscious. She had learned many things in exile, and how to move undetected was merely one of them. The real skill was knowing when to break her own rules. She knelt beside him, her copper eyes catching the moon like a wolf's would. Up close, she could read the poison story written across his skin. 3 days old, administered in wine. Not a battlefield poison, but an intimate one, placed by someone he trusted, someone close enough to touch the rim of his cup. His hand suddenly clamped around her wrist, fever-hot, desperate. "Please," he rasped, his voice like gravel beneath wheels. "Kill me, it's kinder." Sarah did not flinch. Her gift had taught her to recognize pain in all its languages. She reached into the leather satchel she carried, the only possession she had brought from the mountains where she had lived in solitude, hunting her own food, learning the language of herbs and roots that no one else understood. From within, she withdrew a small vial. The liquid inside was luminous green, the color of spring in places where winter had forgotten to fully release its grip. It smelled of crushed sage, of rain on ancient stones, of something alive and desperate to be born. "Drink this," she whispered, and her voice carried the weight of every moment she had waited in the cold. Every night she had spent learning to undo what others had learned to destroy. "I know how to undo the venom." The Alpha King's eyes found hers for the first time. Recognition flickered, not of her face, but of something deeper. The same gift that let him sense a lie in a diplomat's bow, that let him smell treachery on the wind. He recognized what she was. A weapon he had discarded, now returned as salvation. Why? The word tore from his throat like a prayer. "Because rejection is not destiny," Sarah said, pressing the vial to his lips. "And I refuse to be the Omega who watched a king die when she could have saved him." She tilted the vial. The green liquid flowed across his tongue, and his body went rigid. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the purple began to retreat, dissolving like smoke meeting flame. His back arched off the marble, a scream clawing its way free, but it was a scream of healing, of poison burning away beneath something far older than medicine. It was magic meeting venom, and venom losing the war. When it was over, he lay gasping, his body still racked with tremors. But his eyes were clear. Sarah rose to her feet, but his hand caught hers once more. This time, the grip was not fevered. It was steady, aware. "What is your name?" he demanded, his voice still broken but returning to the timbre of command. "Someone you cast away," she answered. "Someone the mountain kept alive." And before he could speak again, before the guards could wake and sound the alarm, she turned and vanished into the shadows as she had come. A ghost made of copper eyes and the memory of poison turning to ash. The Alpha King lay on black marble, alive and alone, holding a vial of luminous green light. And in the darkness, the hunt had truly begun. 3 days passed in careful distance. The Alpha King had not named her. The guards had found him conscious but weakened, the vial of antidote clutched in his rigid fist. His first command had been silence. Tell no one of the poison, tell no one of the cure, tell no one of the face in the darkness. The palace had accepted his decree as they always did, though whispers moved through the corridors like rats in the walls. Poisoned, healed by magic. An Omega with gifts. Sarah watched from the servant passages, the old routes through the castle that existed for those who needed to move unseen. She had studied them during her years of exile, learning every stone, every shadow, every place where moonlight pooled like water. The castle was a living thing to her now. She knew it better than she knew her own reflection. The Alpha King moved through his chambers with the careful precision of a wounded animal learning to walk again. She could smell his confusion from 3 passages away, the scent of someone trying to piece together the logic of his own survival. He had expected death. Instead, he had found her. On the 4th morning, she knew he would come for her. Alphas were simple in their complexity. They hunted what drew their attention. They pursued what challenged their understanding of the world. And she was a riddle wrapped in a gift wrapped in rejection. He would hunt her the way he hunted everything, with single-minded focus and the absolute certainty that he would find her. She waited in the old temple beneath the castle, where the moon's light fell through a broken ceiling in silver columns. The marble here was ancient, older than the kingdom itself. It smelled of cold stone and something sacred, the lingering scent of worship and blood oaths sworn under stars, a perfect place for a confrontation. She heard him before she saw him, footsteps too heavy to hide, made that way deliberately. He was announcing himself, giving her the courtesy of knowing he was coming. An alpha's paradox, brutal but bound by code, savage but slave to honor. He emerged from the darkness in a black coat lined with silver, his body still favoring his left side where the poison had eaten deepest into his bones. But his eyes were sharp. They found her immediately, locked onto her the way a hunter's eyes lock onto prey. "You know the punishment for using magic within these walls," he said. His voice had recovered most of its power, though pain still lived in its corners. "You know the law that binds such gifts." "I do," Sarah replied. She did not move from where she stood in the center of the moonlight. "I also know the law that permits an Alpha King to execute an Omega for practicing witchcraft without sanction. Yet you came back." "I never left," she corrected gently. "The mountain was temporary. This was always where I was meant to return." He moved closer, and she caught his scent, still fevered at the edges, still carrying the ghost of poison, but underneath it, something raw and alive. An alpha in pain was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with claws. "Why save me?" he demanded. "I cast you out. I made you nothing before you were even something." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "Because I am not the Omega you rejected. I became someone else in the cold. I became someone who could choose mercy instead of vengeance, and I chose mercy." The Alpha King stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, still burning with the residue of the poison, fighting to reclaim him. This close, she could smell his confusion and his hunger. Confusion because nothing in his royal education had prepared him for an Omega who spoke in riddles and moved through shadows. Hunger because her gift sang to him now, called to him the way Pack bonded to Pack. "What is your name?" he asked again, and this time his voice was quieter, more dangerous for its softness. "Sarah," she said. "I was born Sarah before I was born to exile." Sarah. He tested the name on his tongue like he was tasting poison again, but this time searching for the cure within it. "I remember now. The presentation, the ceremony, the girl who knelt and—" He stopped. Pain flickered across his features, but it was not the pain of remaining venom. It was older pain, deeper pain. "The girl you rejected because I frightened you," Sarah finished. "You did not frighten me," he said, and the lie was so transparent, so desperate, that it became almost a confession. "You terrified me. Your scent, it was not like the others. It was strange and old and full of power. And I am not equipped to understand something I cannot control." Sarah took a step toward him. In the moonlight, her copper eyes caught the silver and transformed it, becoming almost luminous. "Control is an illusion, Your Majesty. It is what we choose to do when we stop pretending we have it that matters." The Alpha King reached out, and his hand stopped inches from her face. "If I touch you," he said, "the bond will activate, the rejection will reverse. You will belong to me again, and I will belong to you. The magic will demand it." "I know," Sarah whispered. "I destroyed you once. I may do it again. I may be too broken to be what you need." "Then we will break together," she said. "And perhaps that is how things are healed, not through avoiding the fractures, but through filling them with something that refuses to shatter twice." His hand closed the distance. When his palm touched her cheek, the rejection shattered like ice beneath spring. The bond snapped back into place with a force that drove both of them to their knees, him gasping, her glowing with a soft luminescence that turned her skin silver in the moonlight. The Alpha King's crown had fallen away long ago. But in that moment, kneeling beside an Omega with eyes like copper fire, he understood that he had finally found something worth surrendering power to find. The temple around them hummed with old magic, ancient and knowing. Outside, the kingdom slept, unaware that its king had just been reborn. The castle became a tomb of careful distances. They could not be seen together without raising questions that would demand answers neither of them was prepared to give. Sarah had been officially brought before the council as a consultant on poisons and antidotes, a thin cover that fooled no one but provided enough plausible deniability for the Alpha King to exist in the same rooms as her. She moved through the halls now with a different authority, no longer invisible, but cloaked instead in purpose. The rejection's reversal had altered something fundamental between them. Where once they had been bound by the ceremonial magic of presentation and dismissal, now they were bound by choice. The Alpha King felt it as a constant pull, a gravity that bent his attention toward her regardless of where she stood. In meetings, he would lose the thread of conversation, distracted by the presence of her across the room. In the hours before dawn, he would leave his chambers and walk the servant passages, drawn by a need he barely understood. Sarah, for her part, was learning what it meant to be claimed by someone who was terrified of claiming her. On the 7th night, after the temple, she found him in the old library, a wing of the castle that had fallen into disuse, its shelves thick with dust and forgotten things. He stood before an ancient window, looking out at the kingdom as though it were a map of all his failures. "I had you exiled," he said without turning. His gift allowed him to sense her approach long before she entered. "Not merely rejected you as a mate, I stripped you of title, of lands, of the possibility of ever belonging to another alpha. I took your future and threw it into the snow. Sarah moved beside him, careful not to touch. The bond pulled at them both constantly now, demanding contact that felt too dangerous to give in places where eyes might see. You were afraid of what I was, of what I could do, of what I might demand that you could not give. Can you forgive me? His voice cracked at the edges, a sound so raw and real that it shattered the careful composure he wore like armor. Not in words, not in the formal sense, but truly? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. In the distance, the kingdom glittered beneath the stars, unaware that its king was crumbling in the dark. I forgave you the moment I chose to save your life instead of let the venom finish what your rejection began, she said finally. But forgiveness is not the same as healing. Healing requires that we understand what broke and why. It requires that we choose differently, moving forward. Then teach me, he said, and turned to face her. In the starlight, his eyes held a vulnerability that she had never seen in an alpha before, a willingness to be unmade by the truth. Teach me how to choose differently. Before she could answer, a sound echoed through the castle. Urgent, threatening, bells that meant danger. The Alpha King's entire body went rigid, his senses extending outward like a net cast into water. His face transformed, all vulnerability replaced by the sharp focus of a predator sensing prey. Breach, he said quietly. Someone has gotten past the outer gates. They moved together without discussion, driven by a synchronicity that their reversed bond had woven into their instincts. The Alpha King led her through passages she had not yet discovered, deeper into the castle's heart, toward a chamber of stone and starlight where the kingdom's most ancient magic was stored. The poisoner, he said as they descended. Whoever gave me the venom, they were not trying to kill me. They were trying to weaken me. And now they are coming to finish what the poison could not. Behind them, screams echoed through the palace, the sound of guards fighting, the sound of magic being torn through the air like fabric. They reached a chamber where the moon hung low through a ceiling of nothing but sky. No walls, no roof, just the infinite dark and stars scattered like salt. In the center of the floor, a circle of blood had been drawn, ancient symbols pulsing with a sickly luminescence. Sorcery, Sarah breathed. Old magic, forbidden magic. Blood magic, the Alpha King corrected grimly. Someone is trying to bind the kingdom through death, to take control by breaking the foundational enchantments that hold it together. A figure emerged from the shadows then, tall, regal, bearing the marks of an alpha on his skin like scars. His eyes held the cold certainty of someone who had already decided he was right. Cousin, the figure said, his voice dripping with something worse than hatred. Pity. You were always too weak to rule. The poison was a mercy, an opportunity for death without the shame of deposition. The Alpha King's response was instinctive. He moved forward, positioning himself between Sarah and the threat, his body already beginning the shift into his wolf form. But Sarah reached out and caught his arm. No, she whispered. Not that way. She stepped forward, past him, until she stood alone in the center of the chamber. Her copper eyes caught the starlight and held it, transforming it into something alive and dangerous. I am an Omega, she said to the cousin, her voice steady as stone. Born with gifts you will never understand. Raised in exile to become what the weak fear most, a mirror of their own darkness, reflected back, transformed. The cousin laughed, a sound like breaking glass. An Omega cannot stand against an Alpha. It is not nature. It is not law. It is everything, Sarah interrupted. She raised her hands, and the venom she had not used, the poison she had kept hidden, saved for the moment when she would need it most, began to flow from her fingertips like smoke. It was not the poison that had been meant for the Alpha King. It was something older. something she had learned in the mountains, from ancient texts and conversations with spirits that lived in the bones of the earth. It was the antidote made into a weapon. Healing transformed into something that would break the blood magic before it could solidify. The poison spiraled outward, green and luminous, and where it touched the symbols on the floor, they began to dissolve. The cousin screamed, a sound of rage and betrayal, and the Alpha King finally understood. This was not a fight. This was a revelation. The Alpha King watched as an Omega, the very Omega he had rejected, the one he had cast out, stood alone against his enemy, and won not through violence, but through a choice to transform her own pain into power. When it was over, the cousin was unconscious, his blood magic shattered. Sarah stood in the center of the chamber, breathing heavily, her body glowing faintly with the residue of ancient magic. The Alpha King crossed the distance between them and knelt. It was a gesture no Alpha made to anyone but their sovereign, a gesture of absolute surrender and acknowledgement. "I kneel before your strength," he said quietly. "Not to claim you, but to serve what you have become." Sarah looked down at him, this broken king who had rejected her, who had learned from poison and from exile how to be reborn. She reached down and helped him to his feet. "We are each other's redemption," she said, "not because we are weak, but because we chose to be strong together." Outside the chamber, the first bells of dawn began to ring across the kingdom. A new day was beginning. The kingdom did not learn the truth all at once. Truth rarely travels that way. It seeps through cracks, spreads like stains, settles into the consciousness of people slowly until they cannot remember a time before it existed. Sarah was formally named as the Alpha King's Pathfinder, a title so ancient that no one living remembered its meaning. The historical texts suggested it was a role held only in times of great danger, a counselor gifted with the ability to sense poison, to detect corruption, to lead through darkness toward light. It was, the Alpha King announced to his council, what his kingdom desperately needed. No one dared challenge him. The attempted coup had been covered in official language and careful silence. But everyone knew what had happened. An Alpha had tried to take the throne through blood magic. An Omega had stopped him. The natural order, so carefully maintained for centuries, had shifted. Sarah spent her days in the tower that had been assigned to her, a spiral of stone and starlight that overlooked the kingdom like a watchman's post. Here, she studied the ancient texts, the forbidden knowledge, the records of magic that the kingdom had tried to erase but never quite managed to destroy. The truth was, in these books, Pathfinders were not merely counselors. They were the balance to the Alpha's crown. Where strength demanded the right to rule, the Pathfinder carried the mercy that kept strength from becoming tyranny. It was a role that required the bearer to stand beside power without being seduced by it. It was a role Sarah was beginning to understand, that the Alpha King had been hoping to find without quite knowing what it was. On the 14th night, he came to her tower. He no longer announced himself. The bond between them had become so interwoven with the castle's magic that the guards simply knew not to stop him. They had seen what an Omega could do. They had witnessed the reversal of rejection. The old certainties had fractured too thoroughly to be repaired with simple obedience. Sarah was standing at her window when he entered, watching the moon descend toward the horizon like a dying god. She wore a dress of deep silver now, no longer the exile's rags, but the fabric maintained the simplicity of someone who had learned that ornament meant nothing. Her copper eyes reflected the moonlight, catching and holding it like a reservoir of starfire. "They are calling you witch," the Alpha King said quietly. "Yes," Sarah replied. "Some have begun to. The priests whisper it. The nobles mention it in careful language when they think I cannot hear. It is a death sentence, by the old laws." "I know the old laws," Sarah said, and turned to face him. "I know them better than most, because I have lived by them. I was exiled under them. They have shaped every moment of my life since that day you rejected me." The Alpha King crossed to her, and this time he did not hesitate. His hand found her face, and the touch sent a tremor through both of them, the bond singing at the contact, demanding more, more, more. But he held himself still, allowing only this moment of tenderness. "I want to change those laws," he said. "I want to make it so that magic is not treated as witchcraft, but as gift. So that Omegas with power are not exiled but honored. So that you can keep me," Sarah interrupted gently. "So that you do not have to choose between your kingdom and the bond that now holds you captive." "Is that not what love is?" he demanded. "The willing enslavement to another's existence?" "No," Sarah said, and her voice held a sadness that seemed to contain centuries. "That is obsession. Love is different. Love is the choice to remain when you have earned the right to leave." She pulled away from him, and the loss of contact was almost physical, the bond crying out in protest. "I need you to understand something, Your Majesty. I am not here to be your redemption. I am not here to validate your choice to reject me and then accept me. I am here because I choose to be here. And if you change your laws, if you alter your kingdom for my sake, then you are still making the same mistake, still trying to control me, still trying to write me into a story where I am the reward for your transformation rather than my own person with my own purpose." The Alpha King was silent for a long moment. In that silence, Sarah could hear the entire machinery of power grinding to a halt, the certainty that had driven him all his life, the belief that will and strength could reshape the world to his specifications. "Then what do you want from me?" he asked finally, and the vulnerability in his voice was almost unbearable. "I want you to listen," Sarah said, "to the kingdom, to the people who have been living under your rule. I want you to understand that your strength has been a shield, and shields are useful, but they also keep out light. The laws you have about magic, they exist for a reason. Not because magic is evil, but because people feared what they did not understand. And fear creates cruelty. That cruelty has shaped the kingdom for generations." She moved to her shelves, lined with the ancient texts, and withdrew a volume bound in leather, the color of dried blood. "This is the founding doctrine," she said, "written by the first Alpha Kings when the kingdom was merely a gathering of scattered packs. It speaks of the Pathfinder as a necessary counterbalance. Not because the Alpha's rule was corrupt, but because absolute power without mercy becomes a prison for everyone, including the one who holds it." The Alpha King took the book, but his eyes remained fixed on her. "If I do not change the laws," he said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn, "if I do not remake the kingdom for you, then you have truly chosen to stay. Not because you were forced to, but because I see the possibility of what we could build together," Sarah finished. "A kingdom where the Alpha and the Pathfinder stand in balance, where strength and mercy are not enemies, but partners." She stepped closer again, and this time when she touched him, it was with intention. Not the pull of the bond, but the choice of one person electing to be close to another. "This is how love works," she whispered. "When both people are free to leave and neither chooses to." The Alpha King pulled her close, and in the starlight, two broken things held each other up and discovered they were not broken anymore. They were simply ready to be remade. Outside the moon set, the sun began its ascent, and in the tower of stone and starlight, a new age was being born. "Tell us, where in the world are you when this story finds you? At what exact hour does this northern confession reach you? We wish to know how far the moon travels, and at what moments of night it illuminates your own redemptions." The kingdom held its breath for 3 weeks. The Alpha King did not immediately change the laws. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He began to listen. He sat in councils not as a speaker, but as a witness. He walked through the villages beyond the castle walls, asking questions he had never asked before. What did you fear? What did you hope? What would you change if you had the power to reshape the world? And everywhere he went, Sarah walked beside him. It was her presence that shifted things. Where once the kingdom had seen only an alpha, a force of nature to be obeyed, they now saw something else. They saw vulnerability. They saw an alpha king who was willing to stand beside an omega who had been cast out, who had been made nothing, and learn from her. They saw power made humble by love. But not everyone accepted this. In the shadows of the kingdom, something began to move. A resistance that did not have a name yet, but had very clear intentions. The old families, the ones who had built their wealth on the certainty of hierarchy, began to gather. The priests who preached obedience over mercy started to speak in sermon about the corruption spreading through the throne. The noble houses that had pledged their loyalty to the Alpha King for generations suddenly found reasons to withdraw from court. Sarah felt it the night before the fracture came. She was in her tower, reading by candlelight, when the venom sense that had saved the Alpha King's life began to sing in her bones. Not the physical sensation of poison approaching, but something more insidious. The smell of betrayal. The taste of choice made in darkness. The presence of magic being woven in places she could not see. She descended from her tower and found the Alpha King in the war room, standing over maps of the kingdom with his generals, looking at borders and territories as though they were abstractions rather than the homes of people he had sworn to protect. "It is beginning," she said simply. His eyes found hers. "The resistance? Yes, someone is gathering them. Someone is telling them that the kingdom is falling apart, that you are weak, that an omega has poisoned your mind and your judgment." The Alpha King set down his pen. "How long?" "Days, maybe hours. They are moving toward the capital." "Then we do not have time for subtlety," he said, and she heard the old command voice returning, the tone that had ruled armies and bent wills to his specification. "We will announce it, the bond, the reversal, the truth of your gift. We will lay it all bare before they can twist it into lies." "That will destroy you," Sarah said quietly. "The nobles will call it witchcraft. The priests will demand your abdication. The very foundation of your authority rests on the certainty that the hierarchy is natural and unquestionable. If you admit that an omega was powerful enough to save you, that you chose to keep her beside you, you are admitting that the hierarchy is not natural, that it is constructed, that it can be deconstructed. Then let it be deconstructed," he said fiercely. "At what cost?" Sarah demanded. "Not to you, not to me. To the people in the villages who have no magic, no power, no ability to protect themselves if the kingdom tears itself apart?" The Alpha King moved toward her, and when he spoke, his voice was softer, but no less intense. "What would you have me do?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. The venom sense was still singing in her bones, growing more insistent. The betrayal was approaching like a storm front. "I would have you do what I cannot do for you," she said finally. "I would have you choose a third path. Not revelation and revolution, not silence and surrender, but transformation. Change the laws, not for me, but because they are unjust. Do it openly, do it boldly, but do it in a way that the kingdom understands is not surrender to your pathfinder, but evolution of your rule." "They will still resist," he said. "Yes," Sarah agreed, "but if you move first, if you set the terms of the conversation rather than react to their accusations, you maintain power even as you distribute it." The Alpha King turned back to his maps, and she watched as the brilliant mind that had conquered empires began to work through the mathematics of the impossible. The resistance came at dawn. They did not come with armies, they came with words. The leading nobles and priests appeared before the gates and demanded an audience before the throne. They came bearing accusations and carefully constructed arguments about the corruption of the bloodline, the perversion of the natural order, the danger that an Omega with magic posed to the stability of the kingdom. The Alpha King sat on his throne, still powerful, still commanding, still absolutely certain. But beside him, where tradition said there should be empty space, Sarah stood, not as a mate, not as a lesser being, but as the Pathfinder, the title ancient and newly claimed. What the resistance had not anticipated was this. The Alpha King did not defend himself. Instead, he asked questions. Why did they believe the hierarchy was natural? What evidence supported this belief beyond the simple fact that it had always been this way? If an Omega's gift could heal the king when no one else could, what did that suggest about the distribution of power? And then, before they could answer, before they could mobilize their counter-arguments, he announced it. Not as a proclamation forced upon him, but as a recognition of truth that had always existed but been hidden. The laws will change, the Alpha King said, his voice carrying through the throne room with absolute authority. Omegas with magic will not be exiled. Women will be allowed to own land. The priesthood will no longer have the right to declare someone witchcraft without trial. The room erupted. Gasps, accusations, fury. But the Alpha King had already moved forward with the next step. He extended his hand to Sarah, drawing her forward not as a possession, but as a partner in the future he was building. "And I am renaming the role of my closest advisor," he continued. "No longer will it be a position held in shadow. The Pathfinder will be named publicly. The Pathfinder will have authority to speak against even the crown when mercy demands it. The Pathfinder will be the keeper of the kingdom's conscience." He turned to face Sarah directly, and in that moment the entire room understood what was happening. This was not a king admitting weakness. This was a king redesigning his own power structure. "Sarah of the Mountains," he said formally, "will you be the Pathfinder of this kingdom?" Sarah felt the weight of the decision like a physical thing. To accept was to bind herself to the kingdom, to accept responsibility not to this man, but to the people he ruled. It was a choice that could never be undone, a commitment that extended far beyond the bond between them. She thought of the mountains, the cold, the loneliness that had taught her how to be strong. She thought of the rejection that had brought her here and the poison that had changed everything. "I will," she said. And as she spoke those words, the fracture that had been threatening to split the kingdom apart began to heal. Not because the resistance suddenly agreed, but because something larger had shifted. The kingdom had glimpsed a future where power was not absolute, where mercy had teeth, where an Omega could stand beside an Alpha without being consumed by his shadow. Not everyone was satisfied. But satisfaction was not the point anymore. Evolution was. 30 days passed in transformation. The kingdom did not fall into chaos, though many of the old guard had predicted it would. Instead, something stranger occurred. A slow, painful process of people beginning to reimagine what they believed was possible. Omegas who had lived their entire lives in shadow began to speak publicly. Women who had hidden their talents began to practice them openly. The priests who had preached absolute hierarchy found their congregations growing smaller, more resistant, more willing to ask questions. But the resistance had not disappeared. It had simply organized. They called themselves the keepers of the old blood, and their argument was simple. The kingdom was being unmade by weakness. If the Alpha King would not defend tradition, then they would defend it for him. They gathered not in the capital, but in the hinterlands, places where the old ways held strongest, where the fear of change burned brightest. And they had found a weapon. Sarah discovered it the way she discovered all things that threatened the kingdom, through her gift, that strange sense of venom moving through the body of the realm. Someone had captured one of the priests who served the crown, and through blood magic and brutal interrogation, had learned the incantations that bound the Alpha's power to the throne. They were going to use it to challenge his authority in the oldest possible way, through combat. By the laws of the kingdom, if an alpha could be defeated in single combat by another alpha, then the loser forfeited the throne. It was a law that had not been invoked in 3 generations. The old guard knew this. They were counting on it. "They will challenge you," Sarah said to the Alpha King in the privacy of his chambers. The intimacy between them had deepened over the weeks, not yet culminated in a formal bonding, but simmering beneath the surface, waiting for a moment when such vulnerability could be afforded. "I know," he replied. He was studying maps again, but this time with a different kind of focus. "I can defeat any alpha who comes against me. You know this." "Yes," Sarah said, "which is precisely why they will use blood magic to make the fight unfair. They will poison you again." The Alpha King looked up at her. "Can you sense it? Can you prepare me?" "I can," Sarah said, "but there is a cost." She moved to the window and looked out at the kingdom spread below them, the lives being lived, the futures being built, the small, everyday miracles of people learning to hope again. "If I bind myself to you completely," she continued, "if I give you the knowledge and power to withstand any poison they might use, then I will be making a choice that goes beyond being the pathfinder. I will be choosing sides. I will be no longer the keeper of the kingdom's conscience. I will be your weapon." The Alpha King rose and came to stand beside her. "Is that not what love demands? To choose completely? To hold nothing back?" "No," Sarah said gently. "Love demands honesty about what we are willing to sacrifice. I can help you, but not in the way you are hoping. I will not give you absolute victory. I will give you something harder. I will give you the knowledge of how to win, not through strength, but through mercy." She turned to face him. "The keepers will come expecting an Alpha King who will fight them with everything he has. What they will not expect is a king who fights them by refusing to play their game." And so she taught him. For 10 days, she filled his body with knowledge, not poison, but the antidote, not weapons, but understanding. She taught him to feel the magic that the keepers would try to use against him. And more importantly, she taught him to transmute it, to take their venom and transform it into something that would not kill him, but would instead show him exactly how the magic worked, what the incantations were, where the blood ritual was anchored. On the day of the challenge, the Alpha King stood in the arena before the kingdom, bare-chested and glistening with oil, ready to face the challenger that the keepers had put forth, a massive alpha from the northern territories, scarred and ancient, and absolutely convinced of his righteousness. The fight began in the old way, with single combat, with the understanding that the stronger would prevail. But as the challenger pressed his advantage, driving the Alpha King back, the poison came. Sarah felt it from where she stood in the shadows of the stands, watching with her venom sense blazing. The challenger had been given blood magic-imbued poison designed to weaken and disorient. The Alpha King felt it enter his blood, and instead of fighting it, he welcomed it. The transformation was immediate. Where the poison had been meant to weaken him, instead it revealed itself, its composition, its incantations, its source. The blood magic that bound it came from the temple in the north, from a priest who still clung to the old ways. The ritual had required the death of an innocent. The pain of that knowledge hit the Alpha King like a physical blow, and he did something unprecedented. He dropped his fighting stance and spoke, his voice carrying across the entire arena. "You have used blood magic, forbidden by the oldest laws. You have killed an innocent to fuel your challenge. This is not a fight between alphas. This is a crime." The crowd gasped. The challenger, confused and furious, pressed his advantage, believing that the Alpha King had simply surrendered to despair. But as his claws came down, the Alpha King caught them, not with strength, but with the precise knowledge of where the blood magic had anchored itself in his opponent's body. He pressed a point on the challenger's wrist, and the magic recoiled, turned inward, revealing its own secret architecture to its wielder. The challenger screamed as his own blood magic rebounded through him, showing him the weight of what he had done. The innocent who had died, the magic that had been twisted from natural gift into weapon. When it was over, the challenger was on his knees, weeping not from pain, but from understanding. "I am going to show mercy," the Alpha King announced to the kingdom. "Not because I am weak, but because I have the power to show it and the strength to choose it anyway. This Alpha will be imprisoned, yes, but not executed, because if we respond to blood magic with blood magic, if we answer cruelty with cruelty, then we are simply continuing the cycle that the Keepers want to perpetuate." He looked up to where Sarah stood in the shadows, and their eyes met across the distance. "My Pathfinder has taught me that true strength is knowing when not to use force. That true power comes not from dominance, but from the refusal to perpetuate domination. Subscribe if you believe mercy can crown even the fallen." 2 seasons turned before the full extent of the corruption was understood. The trials revealed networks of priests and nobles stretching back generations, all working to maintain power structures that served only the few. Some had been operating in daylight, others in shadow. The keeper of the temple in the north was found to have been performing blood magic rituals for decades, each one designed to ensure that power remained concentrated in the hands of those who had always held it. Sarah moved through the kingdom alongside the Alpha King, and where they went, truth emerged like flowers after rain. Not comfortable truth, not easy truth, but the kind of truth that demands change, that will not allow people to return to comfortable ignorance once they have glimpsed what lies beneath the surface. The hardest part was not discovering the corruption, but deciding what to do with it. The Pathfinder role demanded justice, yes, but it also demanded mercy. It demanded that Sarah hold the scale between punishment and redemption, and the weight of that balance grew heavier each day. In the capital, plans were made for trials. In the villages, people began to speak openly about their grievances. In the priesthood, a schism formed between those who accepted the new reality and those who clung to the old certainties. Some of the priests chose exile rather than adapt. Others chose death, believing they were martyrs to a fallen cause. And through it all, Sarah could feel the kingdom groaning under the weight of transformation. One night, in the tower where everything had begun, she found the Alpha King standing at the same window where she had first received him as a counselor rather than a king. "I am uncertain," he said without preamble. It was the kind of honesty that he had learned to offer only to her. "For the first time in my life, I do not know if I am making the right choices. The trials continue to reveal atrocities. Each day brings new reasons to execute someone, to strip them of power, to unmake them as thoroughly as they tried to unmake the kingdom." "What does your heart tell you?" Sarah asked. "My heart wants revenge," he admitted. "It wants to destroy everyone who participated in the system that we are now dismantling. It wants to be certain that I am right, that my choices are just, that I am not simply replacing one form of tyranny with another." "And what does your mind tell you?" The Alpha King was quiet for a long moment. "That certainty is the luxury of the ignorant. That justice is far more complicated than victory in combat. That I am building something that will long outlive me, and if I poison its foundation with my own need for revenge, I am dooming everyone who comes after." Sarah came to stand beside him. "Then the answer is not certainty. The answer is witness." She began to speak, and what she described was a new kind of trial, one where the kingdom itself would be both judge and jury, where the accused would face not just legal accountability, but the weight of community judgment, where the punishment would be decided not by the Alpha King in isolation, but through careful deliberation that included voices from every level of society. "We will not erase the past," Sarah explained. "We will acknowledge it. We will let people speak the truth of what was done to them. And then we will decide, as a community, what redemption looks like for those who wish to be redeemed, and what justice looks like for those who refuse. That will be agonizing, the Alpha King said. Yes, Sarah agreed, but it will be honest, and honesty, I have learned, is worth far more than certainty. And so they began. The Great Reckoning, as it came to be called, stretched across the entire winter. Day after day, people came forward with testimony. Priests described the rituals they had performed without understanding their purpose. Nobles revealed the systems of bribery and intimidation they had used to maintain power. Soldiers described orders that had violated their own sense of right and wrong. And for each testimony, there was a conversation. Not punishment delivered from on high, but genuine deliberation about what justice meant in a world where systems were more to blame than individuals. Some of the accused were imprisoned. Some were stripped of title and power but allowed to live in quiet exile. Some chose to remain in the kingdom and work toward rebuilding what they had helped to destroy. Some took their own lives rather than face their own complicity. It was messy and painful and far from perfect, but it was real. And in the midst of it all, something unexpected happened. The kingdom began to heal. Not because all wounds were closed, but because they were no longer being hidden. Not because all conflicts were resolved, but because people finally had permission to acknowledge that they existed. Not because everyone was happy, but because everyone had a voice in what came next. Spring came late to the kingdom that year, as though even the seasons acknowledged the magnitude of transformation that was occurring. When the first green shoots finally broke through the snow, the Alpha King declared a festival. Not a celebration of victory, but a commemoration of the beginning of something new. Sarah stood in the tower, looking out at the kingdom adorned in color and light, and felt the weight of what she had become. The Pathfinder, the keeper of the kingdom's conscience, the woman who had been born to exile and had chosen instead to return to power. The Alpha King entered without knocking. The bond between them had settled into something peaceful. No longer the frantic pull of reversed rejection, but the deep, steady certainty of two people who had chosen each other completely and consciously. He wore no crown. The symbolic center of his power had been transformed into a symbol of something different, responsibility rather than dominance. "It is time," he said simply. Sarah understood. The trials were complete. The Great Reckoning had concluded. The kingdom had chosen its path forward, messily and painfully, but authentically. Now came the moment of formal transformation. The coronation ceremony was unlike any that had come before. The Alpha King stood not alone, but flanked by the Pathfinder, and in the presence of the entire kingdom, they exchanged their vows. Not the vows of a human marriage, though many believed that was what was happening, but the vows of partnership, of mutual responsibility, of a commitment to balance that would outlive them both. "I pledge," the Alpha King said, "to rule with strength, but not domination. To listen to the voice of my Pathfinder before acting in haste. To remember always that power is a burden to be borne for the benefit of all, not a privilege to be enjoyed by the few." And Sarah spoke in return, and her voice carried through the assembled crowd with the weight of ancient magic. "I pledge to stand beside you in strength and mercy both, to speak truth even when it is unwelcome, to hold you accountable not to your will, but to your best intentions, to be the voice of conscience, not judgment." And then, in a moment that would be spoken of in legends for generations, they exchanged something that had never been exchanged in a coronation before. Not rings, but books. The Alpha King gave to Sarah the ancient founding text of the kingdom, the one that had first established the Alpha's right to rule. Sarah gave to him the text that she had studied in exile, the one that described the role of the Pathfinder, balance, witness, conscience. And in that exchange, the past and the future were woven together into a single, coherent vision. The kingdom erupted in sound, not the unified roar of military might, but something far more chaotic and alive. Some cheered, some wept, Some stood in stunned silence, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. The old guard had largely retreated or been absorbed into the new order. Those who remained watched from the edges of the ceremony, their faces unreadable, their loyalties uncertain. But many, perhaps most, of the people filling the plaza were young, were hopeful, were beginning to believe that the world did not have to be the way it had always been. That evening, alone in the tower for the last time before moving to chambers befitting the formal role of Pathfinder, Sarah stood at her window and felt the venom sense that had saved a kingdom settle into something new. Not a warning of danger, but a harmony, a sense of rightness, not absolute and perfect, but authentic and hard-won. The Alpha King, who was simply the king now, his authority verified not through strength, but through legitimacy granted by the kingdom itself, entered and drew her close. "Are you happy?" he asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. Happiness seemed too simple a word for what she felt. What she felt was purposeful. What she felt was seen and valued. What she felt was the satisfaction of having helped build something that might last longer than her own life, something that would protect the vulnerable long after she and this king had turned to dust. "I am at peace," she answered finally, "which I think is better than happiness. Happiness is a moment. Peace is a state of being." The king kissed her forehead, and in that gesture was all the transformation they had undergone, from rejection to redemption, from exile to partnership, from two broken people to the architects of a kingdom's healing. Outside, the festival continued through the night. Bonfires burned on the hills, casting their light across the kingdom like the blessing of stars brought down to earth. Music played in the streets. People who had been strangers began to know each other as neighbors. Children born in the time of tyranny learned that they had choices. Women who had been told their whole lives that they were lesser began to understand the magnitude of their own power. It was not perfect. The kingdom still held those who resisted change, who mourned the lost certainties of the old world. There would be continued conflict, continued challenges, continued moments of doubt. But there would also be growth, and mercy, and the possibility of redemption. In the tower of stone and starlight, the Pathfinder stood with the king who had learned to choose strength in the form of compassion, and together they looked out at a kingdom learning to be born into something new. The poison that had been meant to kill had instead become the medicine that saved them all. And in the distance, the moon rose full and bright, silver witness to a coronation that would echo across generations. A reminder that even the deepest rejection can become destiny, and even the most broken of kings can be healed by mercy. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe. Because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive.